Okay, so this is just for fun. I'm going to do a little rendition of what I feel happened to academic philosophy. Okay. To me, it looks like the 20th century was kind of like a showdown at high noon between those who feel that life actually means something and those who feel that ultimately human life doesn't really mean anything. This, from my limited perspective, would constitute a clash, not personal clash. I don't believe these individuals ever encountered each other, but between Jean-Paul Sartre and Ludwig Wittgenstein. Okay, both of these men are referred to as, and I believe consider themselves to be, phenomenologists. Okay, a phenomenologist is a person who tries to understand what consciousness is and how it operates in its broadest general outlines. Okay, so they both of these completely different approaches to phenomenology have overlap with psychological insights. The Sartrean version overlaps with Gestalt psychology, the idea that consciousness always has a foreground and a background. In Sartre's case, he showed how consciousness can alternate between foreground and background. You know, you've got a date to meet Pierre at a certain restaurant at a certain time. You know that Pierre is a very impatient guy. He doesn't put up with slackers. He always shows up on time, and you show up 15 minutes late. So you show up and you don't see Pierre, and he shows how consciousness does this kind of stroboscopic thing where there's this ghost image of Pierre appearing on top of the restaurant, and then it immediately vanishes, and there's the restaurant without Pierre, on and on and on for several minutes. You have this alternation between foreground and background. Anyway, that's one of the things Sartre shows about consciousness. With Wittgenstein and his bunch, it's quite different. Wittgenstein took a linguistic approach, which was picked up by a lot of people, the majority of people who continued with academic philosophy fell in line with Wittgenstein's approach to things, which says that language, grammar, words, definitions, and so forth are what predominate in our understanding of anything. It's all words. The most productive, in my opinion, disciple of Wittgenstein was Alfred Schipske, who said prophetically that the map is not the territory. That came out in the early 1930s. Really amazing that he would say that back then, before television, certainly before the internet and GPS guidance systems and stuff in your car. Really amazing. I know two people, including a bank manager, who actually had serious automobile accidents because they listened to the female voice in their GPS guidance system telling them, drive a quarter of a mile ahead and then turn left. And the thing hadn't been updated properly or whatever the problem was. And there was no quarter of a mile ahead. They just drove over an embankment. And in the case of the bank manager that I know, it was pretty serious. His lower teeth went through his lower lip, and his lower lip had to be sewn up. And he said, "You should see the driver if you think I'm in bad shape." But none of them saw that there was nothing a quarter of a mile ahead. They were actually living in language. They were living in a world of words rather than the so-called real world. Very, very interesting stuff. So this Wittgenstein would say, you see, I told you so. I told you so. Schipske took it even farther than that, actually. A less known little quip of Schipske's is, whatever you say something is, it isn't. Now that sounds a little bit crazy. But Schipske took Wittgenstein as far as anybody ever has in an attempt to help people. He wanted to eliminate all forms of to be from any language. And a disciple of his, I forget the guy's name, developed an actual grammar which operates without any formulation of to be. Mainly, you're eliminating the formulation of this is that. Like consciousness is the soul or something like that. Anything that involves the word is, you're just subtracting that from all of your verbal communications, for formulations, thinking to yourself, talking to yourself, anything. You just don't use the word is or anything like that. Nothing is anything. Well, people have tried that. Albert Ellis, the grandfather of cognitive behavior therapy and the father of rational emotive therapy, allowed one of his books, How to Live With and Without Anger, or Anger, How to Live With and Without It. He had it rewritten in E prime, and it just didn't work. Subsequent editions did not. It did include. He went back to using the word is, because that's the way we think. It's the way we talk. It's the way we write. You can't. It would be similar to men who are very respectful of women, or women who are very respectful of women, and use the word she, where in ordinary parlance or correct grammar, the word he would be there. I admit it's kind of like unfair to women to always use the word he, but when you're talking about like Zen masters or auto mechanics, and I'm sure that there have been female Zen masters and auto mechanics, but like when Sartre uses the formulation, man is the being who is what he isn't and who isn't what he is, okay, which is a tip of the hat to Wittgenstein, actually. He doesn't mean all male human beings. That's not what he's talking about. He means generically both men and women, because that's just the way that in French or in English we talk and we write. You understand that he's talking about human beings, not just male human beings, generically both men and women. Anyway, I'm getting a little lost here in the details. Anyway, Sartre was not afraid to use the word is. Wittgenstein, okay, to cut to the chase a little bit better here, get back on track, Wittgenstein believed that philosophy, academic philosophy, is bunk, bullshit. Okay, supposedly Wittgenstein had two philosophies in the Tractatus, his first book, and then posthumously the Investigations. And supposedly the Investigations was an attempt to dismantle what he said in the Tractatus, which attempted to provide a sort of holistic overall approach to philosophy, but the approach is summarized at the end, where at the end of the Tractatus, Wittgenstein said, whenever somebody makes a philosophical, metaphysical, ontological, whatever, academically formulated philosophical pronouncement, you should show them that there's nothing really behind their words, their signs, and you should refer them to the positive sciences. Most obviously this would, and people have followed his approach, his recommendation. You can see, it used to be when you entered a psychiatrist's office, he would attempt to identify, what your complex was, whether you were an introvert or an extrovert, or whether you wanted to kill your father and marry your mother, or vice versa, or whatever it was. Today they just view you as a bag of chemicals and bones, and they try to find the right drug to put you on, or the right electroshock or whatever they're into, lobotomize you or whatever they want to do. You're not considered to have any kind of soul anymore. They don't play that shit anymore. You're just bones and chemicals, son. We've got to find the right drug for you, and that's all there is to it. Pretty much. Anyway, that's what Wittgenstein recommended near the end of his magnum opus, the Tractatus, one of the most famous philosophy books ever written. Wittgenstein wanted to have the last word in philosophy. He wanted to put an end to it. He believed that philosophy is just basically nonsense. He really believed that. I admit that many of his pronouncements, particularly in the investigations, sound very metaphysical, spiritual, but Wittgenstein didn't have a spiritual bone in his body, so to speak. A lot of people, if you read an introductory book to Wittgenstein, it's likely to show him sitting in the lotus posture, just tripping out. And many of the pronouncements and stories, I was surprised at how many Wittgenstein stories I knew. By the time I got around to reading the New York Times bestseller, Wittgenstein's Poker, even Wittgenstein's Poker attempted to portray him as a mystic. He wasn't a mystic. He was a linguist, operating in pretty much the same territory that Schipske was, general semantics type thing. Wittgenstein was actually a born-again Christian. He carried around Tolstoy's book on the Gospels, which at that time I think it was called The Gospel in Brief. I think it's got a different title today. It's still in print, I think. In fact, I think LibriVox has an audiobook out of it, What I Believe, or something like that. Yeah, but anyway, he always carried extra copies of that and would shove Jesus down people's throats. I swear, okay, you didn't get this in your philosophy class in college. I know, but that is a fact. He was a diehard born-again Christian, even though he was part Jewish, shoving Jesus down everybody's throat. He wasn't interested in Buddha or transcending thought or anything else. He really wasn't. So anyway, even in the investigations published after Wittgenstein's death, I believe, he still believed that academic philosophy was bullshit, was junk, and wanted philosophy to die out. He wanted to be the last academic philosopher who pronounced the uselessness of philosophy so that people would go over to the scientists, to the biologists, physicists, to the computer geniuses, whatever, and forget about philosophy. He wanted to do away with philosophy. So to me, that seems destructive. And it's unfortunate that the major bulk of academics have sided with Wittgenstein. And the question arises, why on earth would an academic philosopher side with a guy who said that life has no meaning in the sense that philosophers have always said it does, and that the only guys we should trust with telling us what life is all about are the evolutionists and the scientists? Why would they side with a guy who says that their discipline, that they've devoted their whole life to teaching professionally? Why would they side with a guy who said that what they're doing is nonsense? Literally, that's what Wittgenstein said. Why? Well, I'll tell you. Imagine, or maybe you are an academic philosopher. Okay, so you're a philosopher, a teacher of philosophy, and you know for a fact that most of the kids taking your class are just taking it for credit. I mean, how many of your students are planning on becoming professional academic philosophers? Not too many, I would assume. You know that they're mostly just, biding their time. They're not all that interested in what you have to teach. And you feel say that you are really interested in what you're teaching, which not all academics are, but say you are. Give you the benefit of the doubt here. You really love what you teach. But most of your students really don't. Well, it kind of lets you off the hook, doesn't it? To be told, don't worry about it. What you're doing is nonsense anyway. Doesn't that make you feel a little bit better? Doesn't that ease your conscience a little bit? So, you can just bide your time and go through the motions. And, maybe even you are interested. You're one of those rare teachers who really does care about philosophy. There are such teachers. I can name you names. At any rate, you know that you've been outvoted. You know that most people don't feel that philosophy means that much. And that the presiding overseer of academic philosophy, the pastor emeritus or whatever, is Ludwig Wittgenstein. And he tells you, don't worry about it. It doesn't mean anything anyway. So fine. So get over it. You can give little speeches at for various multinational corporations or whatever that pays pretty good. You can earn some extra income and, just wait out your retirement, and don't worry about it. It isn't going to make any difference anyway. Nobody's going to listen to you. So, why worry? Okay, so Sartre was a holdout, a dinosaur. He really, really believed that despite the fact that man is a useless passion, his famous pronouncement at the end of Being and Nothingness, a very Schopenhauerian pronouncement, that man wants to be God, but he can't. Schopenhauer, was a little bit more nitty-gritty. Man wants to exist, but he can't ultimately exist. But I side with Sartre because to me it's very obvious that a human life to a human individual like you or me is very, very meaningful. My life is chock full of meaning. I don't care what, talking like my grandmother, I don't care what, Wittgenstein or Schipske or anybody says. To me, life is terribly, terribly meaningful. My life means an awful lot to me, and I would assume your life means a lot to you. Otherwise, you wouldn't even be listening to this. And that's why Sartre didn't just say that man is useless. He didn't say that. Wittgenstein said that, in a sense. That cosmically, man doesn't make any difference. The evolutionists are getting around to that opinion that man is not, the pinnacle of creation. It's just another experiment. That nature is trying. It doesn't really make that much difference. But Sartre believed that, to you and me, we mean an awful lot. My life means a lot to me, and if I have a conscience, your life means a lot to me too. I care about you if I have a conscience. There are psychopaths, or what do we call them today? Sociopaths, I guess, that don't care, psycho killers or whatever, who don't care. But people with a conscience, yeah, my life does mean something to me, and your life means something to me. And if you have a conscience, you feel the same way about me. I matter. People matter. Okay? But ultimately, with the Wittgensteinian approach, which has won out over the Sartrean approach, the linguistic approach over the phenomenological, the truly phenomenological, which gets into kind of like a metaphysical territory a little bit. Life is meaningful. As Sartre said, human experience is not a scientific consideration. What did he mean by that? Now, Sartre kept up with science. He was interested in science. He read scientific journals, and he had nothing against science. But in his discipline of academic philosophy, he pointed out that normally we don't see through, with our eyes. If you get something in your eye, or if something goes wrong with your eye, yeah, all of a sudden you're aware that you do. But normally, all things, going, equal and nothing wrong with the eyes, until I said that you don't see with your eyes, were you seeing with your eyes, whatever you were looking at? Were you standing, inside your head looking through the windows of the soul? No, probably not, unless you're crazy or something. William Blake saw this, way back when. He said, we are led to believe a lie when we see with, not through the eye. What he meant was, human experience is not a scientific set of phenomena. It isn't. We don't think with our eyes. We see with our eyes. We don't think with our brain. Okay, until I said that, were you thinking with your brain? Were you, monitoring the synapses and the chemicals in your brain to make sure that you're understanding? I doubt that very much. You weren't, were you? No. Okay, to a human being, subjectively speaking, even if, God forbid, you got cancer and knew you were going to die, yeah, you would be concerned about, getting the right pain relievers and stuff like that. But, you would still be concerned about the meaning of things. And, unless there was something wrong with your eyes specifically, you wouldn't be looking at things with your eyes. Jonathan Edwards, who, by the way, I don't think Wittgenstein read Jonathan Edwards, but I'm sure that Sartre did. He grappled with so many of the same problems that Edwards grappled with, and it was probably, he considered it embarrassing or corny to admit that he read Edwards or took him seriously. But, most of us believe that, if somebody asks you, where are you? Where do you locate your soul or the seat of your consciousness or yourself? Most of us point to our head. And, when we're asked the question, we sort of imagine that we're located somewhere behind the forehead and between the ears. Alan Watts dealt with this a lot. And he said that there's a difference between the Oriental version of it and the Western version of it. I don't think anymore. I think it's pretty obvious that consciousness has always been similar, regardless of culture, cultural shibboleths or whatever. Okay, and Edwards deals with this very, very skillfully in his book, The Freedom of the Will, which actually is a book about that we don't have freedom of the will, in the sense that we normally think we do. Edwards says, in effect, I'm paraphrasing, you identify yourself as a kind of little guy inside your head that makes decisions, and that's your free will. But, does the little guy inside your head have a little guy inside of his head? Because if he doesn't, then he's just a blind force of nature. Like when the doctor taps your knee and your leg jumps up, and actually, this is what Sartre got around to in Being and Nothingness. Sartre was an existentialist only ethically. His ethic was definitely existential. No excuses. You take full responsibility for everything that happens to you, including your birth. At one point, Sartre was actually telling people, the way Shirley MacLaine later would, that he chose his own parents. In her introduction to her translation, her English translation from the French of Being in Nothingness, Helen Barnes falls all over herself trying to convince the reader that Sartre didn't mean it the way it sounded when he said that we are sexual beings not because we have sexual organs, but rather we have sexual organs because we were first sexual beings before we got sexual organs. He actually says that in Being in Nothingness. And Helen Barnes did not consider the possibility that he really meant it. If you read Ronald Hayman's biography of Sartre, fascinating biography of the strangest man that ever lived, you'll find that he actually was telling his peers, Camus and Aron and de Beauvoir and all those guys and girls, that he pre-existed his birth and chose his parents so that he could grow up to fight the Nazis. He took full responsibility for it. When Sartre said, "This is my war and I deserve it," he meant it literally. Not that he created World War II or started it, but that he chose the parents and the time and the gender and everything of his birth so that he could grow up, just like Shirley MacLaine would later say. Heyman dug up the documentation on that. He also dug up some amazing documentation on Sartre's relationship to existentialism. In some early interviews with Sartre, in French magazines that were printed in the French language and never got reprinted, fortunately for Sartre, his first take on it was, the interviewer asked him, well, you've been crowned king of the existentialists. How do you feel about that? And Sartre actually said word for word, he said, I'm not an existentialist. I can't be an existentialist. I don't even know what existentialism is. I've never studied it. Well, what he found out is that his ethic was existential, and he spent the rest of his life trying to form a bridge between his ethic, which is to take full responsibility for everything, including your birth, and not make any excuses. I didn't choose my parents. It's not my fault that they screwed me up. No, he said, no, you chose your parents for reasons. Find out what the reasons are and take full responsibility for it. But he was never able to connect the dots between that very, very extreme ethic, which is existential, that is the existentialist ethic, and his phenomenology, which is really, really terrifying. Sartre was a very courageous man, and he really was very curious about what it really means to be a human being. Okay? Which means, what is consciousness? Okay? In Being and Nothingness, man is portrayed not as having a consciousness, but as being consciousness. Okay, there is a difference. You're not a thing, like a brain or something, that has consciousness. Again, it's not a scientific thing. It's the way that we actually experience life, which is not scientific. You can't subject human experience to scientific experimentation in a lab. Not really. In Being and Nothingness, you are consciousness. You don't have a consciousness. And what Sartre saw, and he looked at it, and he described in detail, even while he was trying with all his might to draw a connection between his existential ethic, where you must take full responsibility for everything, to what he saw about what you are as a consciousness. And what he saw is that consciousness is not a thing. It's not an object. It can't really make an object out of itself. It can't. You might say, well, wait a minute. You're talking about consciousness right now. Aren't we making an object out of consciousness? Well, not really. Not literally. Because these are just ideas. Okay? The ideas, if you're paying attention, are not, and as you interpret them, are not, they're not consciousness. The ideas aren't looking back at you. The ideas that you've got right now are not looking back at you. But rather, you're looking at them. Okay? And the ideas are not consciousness itself. They're ideas about consciousness. The ideas aren't conscious of you. You're conscious of them. Okay? Consciousness, even when you're conscious of somebody else, you're kind of like giving them the benefit of the doubt. I mean, this is the problem of solipsism that so many people have grappled with. How do you know that the other person's consciousness is the same as yours? Because, you can't really experience the other person's consciousness from their point of view, unless you get into like Stephen King science fiction stuff. But, you really can't, you like End of Watch, he gets into that sort of thing, but you can't really do that. The other person's consciousness is something that you grant, unless you want to shut yourself up in a kind of madhouse, of solipsism, as Schopenhauer called solipsism. It's a kind of madhouse with no windows, where you assume that, other people don't have the same kind of, aren't really conscious like you are, but that's crazy. You don't want to do that. But still, consciousness can't really be directly conscious of itself. What Sartre saw about consciousness, is starting with Husserl. Husserl came up with a rather amazing idea that consciousness is always consciousness of something. Well, okay, so what else is new? But this was like an amazing thing. It's like when Gertrude Stein formulated the statement, a rose is a rose is a rose, and everybody said, well, everybody knows that. And she said, yeah, but pay attention to that. Have you ever considered that? Husserl formulated the beginning, the way he kicked off his discipline of phenomenology is that consciousness is consciousness. Consciousness is always conscious of something. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was Heidegger who took it. I'm seeing Husserl and Heidegger through Sartre's eyes, just like I see Immanuel Kant mainly through Schopenhauer's eyes, because I can't really get that deeply into all the terminology. And Heidegger, as excited as Sartre was about the guy, it seems kind of stodgy and a little bit too plodding for me. But with Husserl, I don't really have the time at the age of 67, almost 68, to be looking up, a couple of new terms on every page or something. I'm just not young anymore. I can't do that. So anyway, as I understand it, Husserl came up with the rather non-startling idea that consciousness is always consciousness of something. Okay? And correct me if I'm wrong. Be nice, but correct me if I'm wrong. Heidegger came up, he extended that. Okay? And Heidegger came up with the extension of that idea that consciousness is always consciousness of something that consciousness is not. Okay, like right now we're entertaining ideas about consciousness, but the ideas are not looking back at us in the same way that we're looking at them. Okay, so consciousness is always conscious of something, and that something is always something that consciousness is not. Okay, Sartre picked up the ball from there. What he said was, consciousness is always conscious of something that consciousness is not. Which resulted in his famous formulation, man is the being who is what he isn't and who isn't what he is. I mean, like, that you're a waiter or you're a rocket scientist or whatever you are, but that knowledge is not what you are. You are the consciousness of that knowledge, okay? So you're always in this hall of mirrors kind of thing. And consciousness, according to Sartre, just goes from one thing to another to another. In fact, it's even worse than that, because you can never exactly pinpoint exactly what consciousness is on, because the moment you do that, it's gone on to something else. It's like the only time you can't be is now. The be here now. Sartre, if asked about it, I don't know if he ever was, but he might say something like this. Okay, let's pinpoint now. What do you mean by now? Okay, I'm going to put my forefinger, my right index finger, on the palm of my left hand, and that will define the present moment. Okay, let's do that. Okay, and at the moment that my right index finger touches the palm of my left hand, I'm going to pronounce the word now, and that'll be the present moment. Okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3. Now. Okay, I did that. When did I do it? Did I do it now? The one point in time that you can't be is now. The present moment never did or never does exist. It won't. It doesn't. Now Sartre might take me to task for formulating it this way. I think he had a couple of little verbal writing things that kind of contradict what I'm saying. But the past is real. The past is absolutely real because it did happen. And when Napoleon said, I believe it was Napoleon who said that history is a myth agreed upon, he couldn't have been farther from the truth. History consists of countless myths, and there's no total agreement on what any of it actually means, or whether or not this or that part of it is true. Especially now with the internet. I mean, you may think because you have a lot of Facebook friends or people are agreeing with you on Snapchat or whatever, that, you've got a lot of concordance. But if you really get into it, there's not a whole lot of agreement on anything. You can't really say that consciousness even goes from one thing to another to another. It's a constant stroboscopic alternation between background, foreground, and everything else. In the first place, consciousness just keeps going on from one thing. It just keeps going on. And you can never really stop it. The past and the future are real. The future will happen, if not to you. You might die before a certain future takes place, but other people presumably will go on, or animals or insects or whatever. And but the past did happen, even though we can't really precisely agree on anything. If we really get into that and question the other on how he or she perceives it. But the present moment just doesn't exist. And Sartre really saw that. It's a little bit horrifying. What Sartre came up with is that consciousness cannot be its own object. It can never precisely say what it's consciousness of, because the moment it does that, it's on to something else. That was, maybe a moment ago, but it's not really what you're doing now, because now you're trying to figure out what consciousness is doing now, which the moment you identify it, it's gone, and it's doing something else. So Sartre came up with something like, well, in one place, and I can show you where, in Being in Nothingness, he said that consciousness is not just absolutely spontaneous, not a thing that is relatively spontaneous, like Coltrane riffing on my favorite things or whatever, but jazz musician, improvising on a theme. No, consciousness is spontaneity itself. It's absolute spontaneity. Consciousness is absolute spontaneity. It's part of a sentence in Being in Nothingness, where he got so close to this horrifying truth that you and I are a quality that existence, the universe, life, whatever you want to call the big picture, adds to itself in order to be conscious of things like the sky and this recording or whatever you're conscious of, your computer, whatever. It's kind of like when the number 0 was introduced into mathematics. It comes from India. I studied it at one time. I forget the exact century in which this happened, but the number 0 was not always part of math. It comes from India, I believe. And when the number 0 was added to mathematical activity, it potentiated everything. It resulted in Leibniz, I believe, discovering binary or formulating binary arithmetic a few centuries ago, whenever that was. And he couldn't do a whole lot about it but write books on it. And then, Bill Gates and Wozniak and these guys, using it to make computer language, which is, I believe, the first computer language, or one of the first computer languages, was 0 and 1. I think it's still in use. I'm not an expert on that. But you can see how far it went. The number 0 potentiates everything. Without 0, you can't do a whole lot with math. You've got to count on your fingers or an abacus or use those clunky Roman numerals or whatever people were doing before 0 came along. And that is what man, generically men and women, that is what man does. You and I come in to the world, according to Sartre, as literally, not figuratively, folks, but literally nothing. That's what Being in Nothingness is about. Okay, Helen Barnes tried to soften the blow. She said man, generically men and women, man is both being and nothingness. But that's not what Sartre saw. It's not what he very courageously reported on, because it's not what he wanted to see. But because he wanted us to be responsible for everything that happens to us, as well as everything we do. But you can't be totally responsible if you're not a thing. Okay? How can a non-thing be responsible for anything? You can't be. So he never was able to make that connection. And that's basically why he gave up on academic philosophy. He had a kind of nervous breakdown at the end of Being in Nothingness. After composing that, he said, well, philosophy is kind of hard and it's time consuming and I needed to take a rest. But he never went back to, really, diamond hard, brilliance in philosophy ever again. He just said, I've done what I could and I didn't enjoy the results, and that's the end of it. In effect, that's what he did. According to Sartre, you and I do not have consciousness. We are consciousness. And consciousness is not a thing. It can't be isolated scientifically and studied in a laboratory. Now you might say, wait a minute, what about all those brain things? We do know a lot about the brain, and a lot of fascinating discoveries. If you read Gifts of the Crow is an amazing thing, comparing our brains to the crow's brain. And yeah, we do know a lot about that. But the consciousness that knows all about this stuff or can learn about it is not what those guys were writing about. It just isn't. They talk about, operations, brain operations and brain potentialities that are very similar between people and the crow, but really, truly not the same as consciousness itself. Okay, remember now, Sartre is not afraid to use the word is. So let's just cut to the chase. Sartre taught, in effect, that, paraphrasing now, but consciousness is a quality that life adds to itself. That is the quality of spontaneity, absolute spontaneity. You might say, well, I don't always behave in an absolutely spontaneous manner. Let's say that I'm going to buy a new house, or I'm going to move from one state to another, from Arizona to California, whatever, vice versa. I'm going to take 6 months to do it. I want to make sure that I do this right. Okay. And you're going to set aside at least an hour every day to plan and prepare for that. You want to really, really make sure that you're on top of this. Okay, fine. But you take any 5-second or even 5-minute increment of that planning and preparing process, and you look at it, if you were able to do that, if you were able to isolate, let's say, 30 seconds of that elaborate planning process, did you plan that 30-second interval? Consciousness actually just keeps flowing. It can never stop. It can't really stop on any particular object. And in effect, there is no particular object. Consciousness is a flow. It's a quality. The quality is it just keeps going on. And it's not really ultimately under its own control. So what Sartre wound up doing was disproving his own ethic, the idea that we should take 100% responsibility for everything, because what he showed, and he didn't want to see it, but he was honest and courageous enough to report on what he saw, we're just doing stuff. It is more in connection with the Christian ethic, the original Christian ethic by the original guy, Jesus, who said, to forgive everybody for everything endlessly. A Course in Miracles says the same thing, and because ultimately we just did what we had to do. And Sartre didn't want to see that. There's only one of the study books that I have on Sartre. Most of them I've sold back to Bookman's fabulous bookstore in Flagstaff, Arizona, because they just kind of missed the point. Most of them assume that Sartre succeeded in providing a foundation for his ethic, that we should take full responsibility for everything that we do because we were behind it and decided to do it. And even Sartre seemed to believe that he had proven it. But I think, if he was really backed into a corner, he would have admitted that he didn't. As I say, he gave up on philosophy because he really couldn't provide that foundation that he wanted to. Neil Levy is the only one that wrote a book on Sartre, Levy, an Englishman, I believe, as I recall. He said there is no room for free will in being in nothingness. Interestingly enough, the several passages that Levy quotes showing that Sartre shot himself in the foot on that score, disproved his own, made impossible his own ethic, they're not as convincing as the ones I could show you in Being in Nothingness, where Sartre, in detail, in minute detail, almost metaphysically really, shows that we can't really legitimately take responsibility except arbitrarily. If you want to do that, go ahead and do it. But he never showed why we should. He showed why we don't have to. I'm not saying that you shouldn't take responsibility for anything. I'm not, telling you you should become a psychopath or a sociopath or anything. But I'm just saying that Sartre never really demonstrated a logical reason why you should take responsibility for anything, let alone, your own birth. In academic philosophy, I've been struggling with Being in Nothingness since 1967. I generally read it more like poetry than like philosophy, because the understanding then kind of just flows over me, and the next day or the next year or whatever, I go, oh, that's what he meant. Like Emily Dickinson's poetry. If you ever understand some of her more obscure poetry, be sure to make a note of it in the margin of the book or in your computer or whatever, because the next time you read that poem, it's very elusive. Some of her stuff, you might not remember what it meant. It's the same with Sartre. Walter Kaufmann, the Nietzsche guy, admitted that he really didn't understand Sartre. 90% of it he just didn't really get. And that made me feel a lot better. But it's like 90% of Dickinson's poetry I don't get unless I'm right there at the time that I read it where she was, and then I resonate with it. Same thing with Sartre. Okay, so I'll see you later.